So we're going to start right on time tonight. Thank you all for coming. My name is Helen Zeerip. I own Teddy's Transport. I'm the founder of Grant Me Hope. Grant Me Hope is a nonprofit that tries to get foster children adopted before they age out and face homelessness. I found out that a lot of foster children are targets for the sex traffic trade, and that bothers me deeply, as I'm sure it bothers you too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here tonight. So we are very blessed to have just in our own neighborhood nonprofits that are working to fight human trafficking. One of them is Rachel VerWys. She is the co-founder of Solutions to End Exploitation. She is going to be our first speaker tonight. We will have a time of question and answer after each speaker. So if you've got a question, just stand up so we can see you, because you won't have a mic and it'll be harder to hear because it's a little windy, okay? So we will have a Q&A time. Today, I got a phone call from one of my customers for Teddy's Transport. I've worked with this lady probably 10 years. And she said, Helen, I seen that you are doing a thing tonight on sex trafficking. And I'm like, yeah. I said, are you going to come? And she's like, no. But she said, I wanted to tell you something. And I said, what? She said, I was a victim of sex trafficking when I was 13 years old. And I dropped my eye teeth because I had no clue. And it was her stepfather that was, I guess, prostituting her out. And her mother never knew because he did it while she was at work. And it was just very sad to hear. And she informed me that she didn't realize until 8 years ago what exactly all happened. Her mind, I don't think, even could wrap around it as a 13-year-old, really what had happened to her. And it just made me think, wow, it's people we know, and we're not even aware of it. So let's learn a lot tonight, and here is Rachel VerWys.
Thanks, Helen. Well, thank you for organizing this event tonight. I think we're really honored to be here together to talk with you, and I recognize tonight is a beautiful summer evening, and you have chosen to spend it here with us. And so we want to acknowledge that we are going to share information and stories that are really difficult, and we're talking about people. We're talking about women and children in our own community, and so we will go through. We have a lot of information to cover, but just recognize that there may be times when you just need to take a deep breath and pause, because the tragedy and abuse of human trafficking is really horrific, and so we want to acknowledge that, because we also hold on to hope. And in 2020, actually, I started the year with Representative Whiteford in Lansing at a legislative day. And one of the quotes we shared there, without knowing what was about to happen in our communities, in our nation, and across the globe with a pandemic, was this quote about hope. And it's attributed to St. Augustine, and it says, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are." Tonight, we are inviting you to be a part of a movement. This is one moment in time, but we believe that we make up a collective that creates the change we hope for. That it's in each moment, in every conversation, changes in mindset and policy and practice that will create a future free from human trafficking. We're talking about a really complex problem tonight, and actually at a national level, there are identified 25 types of human trafficking happening across the United States. We are not going to go through all 25, because then you'd be here till the sun went down. We are going to get into a couple just to help us understand the complexity. So we're going to ask you to think about, what is your commitment that brought you here to this place tonight? How do you want to be part of the change that we all hope for? Because we believe it can happen, and that's the hope that we hold on to, and it takes a lot of courage and anger all mixed in to hold that hope. and bring it forward. And I think it's telling that the nonprofit Helen runs also uses that word, because the long journey forward is a long one to create the change, and it takes commitment. So we thank you for being a part of what we think is a commitment to a new way in our community and across our state, in our nation, and world, ultimately. So if you see up here to the right against the rock is a sign. It says Esquire Spa. This sign hung in my neighborhood in Grand Rapids at the corner of Division and Burton for over 30 years. Another sign was prominently displayed next to it that said XXX, American Girl Rubdowns. So for 30 years, a building storefront existed in our neighborhood that exploited women, day in and day out. I moved into back to Grand Rapids in 2014, and I would drive past this storefront every day to bring my kids to school. So fast forward, a couple years ago, I was invited to come to Division the day that the signs were taken down. And an investor, a local business person in our community, bought the building and shut down the illicit massage business that had been there for over 30 years in our community. And then I took the signs home. My husband was not thrilled that I walked in with this sign and a few others, wondering what we were going to do with them. And now I get to tell him tonight we actually used it. We've used another sign as well to create a piece of artwork. But this is a sign for us about the blatant display of exploitation that still exists. There is recently a prosecution in West Michigan of a trafficker that had been also working in the community for over 30 years. And you can, when we often present, we use PowerPoints and videos. We don't get to do that tonight. So if you want to, you can look it up on Fox. Urbina was a trafficker that worked in West Michigan and exploited women and teenage girls for over 30 years. And one of the survivors spoke to the news about that experience. And what she said was this, and I think this is, to sum up, how do you define human trafficking, is he destroyed my life. And for years, that abuse had ramifications for her personally, in her children's lives, and really in the community, I would say, broadly. Her exploitation is a story, and it's one of many. We did a data research project in 2017 that showed, as of right now online, there was generally every year about 1,000 new victims of human trafficking each year in the greater Grand Rapids area. Many of those victims, who we also interviewed with a survivor leader, became victims at age 15. And so Stacy's going to talk more about that piece as we go on, the connection to how we protect and prevent human trafficking. But we want you to understand, too, the definition of what it is, because there's a spectrum of abuse and exploitation in our community. And human trafficking involves one of three things, or both, which are force, fraud, and coercion. Every year, millions of men and women and children around the world suffer from human trafficking. It destroys their life, like the one survivor said. And that happens with the use of violence or manipulation, fraud, like false job opportunities, coercion, threats of harm, grooming, controlling of money, and force, violence, abuse, forced drug and alcohol use. And to think about how the dynamics of this happen is to recognize it is a business model. There's always a third party profiting in human trafficking. So it isn't a choice that someone has. There's always profit involved. So when we look at a sign like this that existed in a community for over 30 years, and a lot went through there, that means a lot of women were bought and sold every day. And the other day, a friend asked me, how did you get into human trafficking specifically? We both have backgrounds in social work. And for me, it was learning about the data, knowing that it was in my own neighborhood, and this commitment that once you know something, you can't unknow it. And I think we're at another moment in history where we have the opportunity to change broken systems that have existed in our nation for years. So you might think like, how was a spa like this being advertised and nothing was done? How did it pop up overnight? Well, if we look at the history of slavery in the United States, we know that the transatlantic slave ships stopped at a certain time, that laws were passed and changed. At the same time that that happened, on the West Coast, there was another slave trade happening from China. And Chinese women were being brought over to the United States, to San Francisco. There's recently a book published by a woman named Julia Flynn Saylor called The White Devil's Daughter, which is a kind of an inflammatory title. But that is what the traffickers called the abolitionists at the time, who were trying to stop this horrific trafficking and exploitation of young Chinese women who were brought to the United States. And we've seen that then become an industry still today in the United States. We've, at C, taken the time to research the economy of demand of the industry here in West Michigan and across the country. So in the greater Grand Rapids area, in business storefronts, just in the illicit massage industry, there's a $6 million economy. And that's only in about 15 business locations. If we look at some of the other places in the United States where we know what's happening, we just finished the study in Denver, Colorado, where there's over a $35 million economy. So it's not just in West Michigan, but it's across the country where we know exploitation is happening day after day. And it's become, I think, painfully clear that we need a new movement that involves all of us from every sector addressing the problem. And what I love tonight is that we have three of us who are in different sectors. In education, Stacey's at Ottawa ISD, and Representative Whiteford, who at a policy level is changing laws that allow exploitation to go on in our community. The purpose of our studies on the economy was to shed light on really a criminal enterprise that we don't have a lot of data on. Right now we have a lot of data from people that is just proxy data, like we think we see it happening. So how do we change policy? How do we change practices when we don't have hard numbers? Because most trafficking victims don't self-identify, like Helen shared about her friend who didn't understand what was happening. And that's due to the trauma and that exploitation causes. We know, for instance, in the illicit massage industry, there's debt bondage. So that fraud and coercion we talk about is a false job offer, help with immigration paperwork to get a visa, but then once the person is here, the job is not what they signed up for, and they are burdened with thousands of dollars of debt bondage that is sold to someone else. That's human trafficking, even before they ever have worked a day in the United States. The same thing is happening with teenagers from our own communities. And we want to talk about the vulnerabilities of how did this happen? How can human trafficking affect anyone in our community? And I want to first talk about myths before we get to the vulnerabilities. Because lately, online, we've actually been working really hard to debunk some myths that we've seen spread virally. And one of them, I've had friends post on their Facebook pages about seeing a creepy white van in a neighborhood that's kidnapping kids. And that is a myth. We know most human trafficking victims are not kidnapped off the street randomly. there is a very concerted effort to make connection and establish a relationship. And Stacy will talk about this a little bit more, but to groom them to have trust in the person that is trafficking them. So if you see posts like that on the internet, don't share them, because it perpetuates a false fear around paying attention to more vulnerabilities that we know exist. Also, women being followed in grocery store parking lots by someone. Again, another myth. The randomness of it is hardly ever the case. We've been posting on our Facebook page, and you can go and see Solutions to End Exploitation, a collection of videos by a survivor leader. And she interviews VerWys investigators from Atlanta who talk about the fact that they have really never done an investigation in which the victim didn't have some connection to the trafficker somehow, in which they tried to, the trafficker through manipulation and lying and coercion, connected with them before they had contact. Another myth is that it only happens overseas. So you're here tonight to learn more about it in our own community. Often we talk about victims and vulnerability, and I think we also need to change the conversation to demand. It is a myth that you do not know anyone who would buy sex. I think we need to start talking more strongly in our communities about what are the precursors that lead someone to buy people. Demand exists, and it doesn't just happen. Online exploitation is increasing, and our kids are now going to school online and being exposed to more than we want them to see or experience at a young age, because there's people who specifically go online and try to manipulate and exploit. Recently, at one of our meetings with the FBI Victim Services Group, she shared that there are more open investigations right now with online crimes than in the past. And so if we think about why people would buy sex, that means we need preventative factors for boys and men and women that change that story. The other myth would be that victims know they're being trafficked, that they had a choice. I often think of the analogy of a frog in hot water, right? So if the frog starts in lukewarm water and then you slowly turn it up, it doesn't realize it. And in many ways, the coercion and the force that happens in a trafficking relationship is much the same way. A lot of survivor leaders that I have talked to would not have identified themselves as being trafficked until many, many years later. So what causes these vulnerabilities? What increases the risk of being exploited? One of, I think Michigan in particular is doing more work around this, and across our nation is recognizing adverse childhood experiences. I think this is a huge paradigm shift for us to not say to victims, what is wrong with you, but what happened to you? Because that is a different perspective than trying to understand how the victim might have had a choice, but instead understanding the trauma that someone has experienced that would lead them to connect with someone who might exploit them. So there are 3 major categories that we look at that show us vulnerability. One is social factors. So we know when you live in a low-income situation, there is hardships that you experience, and you may be looking for a job desperately. I think of the pandemic right now and those who have lost jobs. We all want to provide for our families, and if you are searching, you're going to answer job opportunities and might not know that it's an exploitive job. There's signs posted around neighborhoods often in my community that advertise jobs that I know probably are not jobs that are following labor and wage laws. If we look at inequity across our communities, we know that the research shows
that there's racial disparities and racism that still exists and impacts outcomes in our community. Household factors. Being separated from your family of origin is something that can affect you for years to come. And so if we think about youth aging out of the foster care system, we know that that creates a vulnerability because there isn't a connection to a safety net that could be there to help. I know when I was 18, and since my parents are here tonight, they would probably attest to the fact that I was not ready at 18 to be independent and live on my own without connection to them still, even as an adult, a legal adult. Mental health issues. When there's mental health instability in a family, that can create chaos for a child. And maybe they may look to other places for stability. Substance abuse in a family. Other family factors like abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual. Neglect and parental capacity all create vulnerabilities in a score. As we learn more about adverse childhood experiences, I think we begin to understand again what happened in a child's life often shows us outcomes later on and their vulnerability to exploitation. Like I said earlier, when we interviewed and talked with 125 women in our community who are being exploited, the average age that exploitation started was 15. 15 years old is a teenager. I think we know that with the exposure of more and more online connectivity, as we do more research, we expect that age will continue to drop. And so Stacey is going to talk more about the indicators and what to look for, because we think the prevention and work starts when kids are young. And so she's going to talk more about what we look for and what happens next.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. This is a great experience that we're all having together tonight, that we're all able to come together and talk about this important topic. My name is Stacy Sills. I work for the Ottawa Area Intermediate School District. And what I do there, I'm a health consultant, and I'm also a McKinney-Vento homeless coordinator, which means I'm the homeless grant coordinator. So part of those two things that I do sort of intersect with human trafficking in both ways. When this came across my desk about 7 or 8 years ago, I had heard about one case in the whole state of Michigan at the time, and I said, I've got a lot of other
really important things that I could be doing instead of talking about this topic that no one's ever heard of except across the world, not here in the United States. But then I went to a training similar to this, and I learned otherwise. And I feel like once you know, shouldn't I not move? I'm used to running around. I feel like once you know this information, it's hard to turn your back on it. And so going from saying no to even learning about it to now being the chair of the Taskforce, that's how I went from one place to another. So I'm excited that you're all here tonight as well to learn about this topic. I'm always curious to know sort of where the audience is on this whole process. So I've just, with social distancing in mind, because I know we can't do a lot of talking with each other, if you would just raise your hand according to your knowledge and background of human trafficking. So if you feel like you're down from a 1 to 5, so 1 being this is pretty much the first time you've heard about human trafficking, you're really not quite sure how everything is going except you just heard Rachel's information, and up to 5 being I feel like I'm an expert, but I just want to kind of get my my bearings with everything else tonight. Where are you? So just raise your hand and show a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 as to sort of where you feel like you are with your knowledge base with human trafficking. Okay. So this is what I see a lot of times where I go. There's a huge range. I really usually see a lot of 2s, where it's not their first time they heard about it. However, there's still a lot to learn. And I would think that all 3 of us that have talked about human trafficking would also say there's a lot to learn. There's a lot going on out there that we don't know about. And there's just a lot that is unfortunate that is sort of hidden behind the scenes. So we're going to share with you tonight what we do know, and then you can take that with you and do what you want with it. And I'm going to give you some resources and some options that you can do towards the end of my presentation tonight as well. So I wanted to start with the indicators, and it kind of goes along with what Rachel was talking about with vulnerabilities. So we look at, sorry, not used to being outside doing presentations. So we look at vulnerabilities and kind of, what people are at risk of when we think about human trafficking. And then we think about the indicators and what we could think about as when we're looking at people going, are they being trafficked? Are they not? Should I be concerned? And so with that, we're going to talk about some things that you could possibly think of and do. So there's some different indicators that you can think about between labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Those are the two main types of trafficking. And with labor trafficking, which is probably a little more prevalent than you would think on this side of the state, with a lot of our migrant workers that we have on the west side of Michigan. With labor trafficking, if you just know about and hear about people talking about how they're not being given the wage that they're supposed to be given, they're not giving them their paychecks when they're supposed to be. They owe a debt to their employer that they can't pay off. Things like that. Those would be some indicators where you might think, wow, maybe I should step in and help out and see what I can do. With sex trafficking, there's a lot more. There's a lot of things that just may be more prevalent to you that you might notice. And I'm going to go through some of those right now. So behavioral, if you notice a person, and a lot of times we think of a young person, it doesn't have to be necessarily a young person, but like Rachel said, 15 was the average age that a person is being trafficked. So a lot of times we do think of our youth when we think about people being trafficked. Unfortunately, it can even be a lot younger than that, which is really disheartening. So it's important that we keep our eyes open for this type of thing. So some other things behaviorally, if you notice a person that maybe that you know of their behavior prior to some of these things, and maybe you notice that they're not having eye contact with you, they're very fearful or timid with things that they weren't normally. If you notice things like visible bruises, a huge sign that unfortunately happens, or even tattoos, where there might be a tattoo where the trafficker is actually branding their victim. It could look like, it could actually be the person's name. The trafficker's name is on them. It could look like a label, different things. A lot of times it's by their face, so it's very visible. It's on the back of their neck, even in their mouth. So just if you notice things that just don't look right, if you notice that the person is using a lot of language that has to do with trafficking, if they know a lot about the industry, if they know a lot about what goes online with pornography. I know that's sort of one of those topics that no one wants to talk about, but the porn industry is a huge factor in human trafficking. It has a huge demand for trafficking. The people that are in a lot of the pornography videos and pictures most of them are not there by choice. A lot of them are much younger than the age of 18, and so that's definitely an illegal act for them to be on those pictures and videos. Socially, if you just notice, that the person is not interacting, if they're not going to school, things like that you just see that are different, those things might be things that you want to look into. If you're interested, both Rachel and I bought cards tonight from the Blue campaign, and there are some resources up here that actually have a small card that you can take with you. It's like a business card, and it has a lot of the indicators right on it, and you can just keep it in your pocket or your wallet or just take it with you so that you have those. The next thing, some of you may have this handout, maybe those of you in front have it.